The grain buyer crouched at the south wall and ran his thumb along the sill the way a man checks a casket seal, slow, deliberate, already knowing. Behind him, the woman stood in the yard with flour dust on her forearms, watching. The wind pulled at her apron. Neither of them spoke. He straightened, opened his ledger, and wrote without looking at her. Then he said the only thing he had come to say: "You do not own wheat until you keep rats from owning it first." She had 200 bushels behind that wall. She had 6 months of winter ahead of her, and she had no answer for him, not yet. Ragna Brekke had not planned to become a widow at 23. Nobody plans that, but the threshing belt on the Grandin Bonanza farm did not care about plans, and when it caught her husband's sleeve in August of 1885, it pulled him into the machinery before the man beside him could shout. They buried what remained on a Tuesday. By Wednesday, Ragna held a 160-acre homestead claim, 32 acres of broken sod, a granary with warped lower boards, and no one left alive who was legally obligated to help her. She could not sell the claim. The debt on it exceeded what any buyer would pay for unproven land, with a single-room soddy and a grain shed that leaned east in the wind. She could not walk away. The homestead law required continuous residence, and if she abandoned, the bank in Fargo would pursue the debt without the land to offset it. She could not marry for rescue. The men who offered came with terms worse than the bank's. One wanted the claim signed over before the wedding. Another wanted her to cook for a bunkhouse of 9. So Ragna stayed. She stayed through the winter of 1885. She stayed through the planting season of 1886, when she hired a neighbor's team for 2 days and put 18 acres into hard red spring wheat with her own hands on the seeder. She stayed through a summer so hot the creek dropped to a trickle and grasshoppers chewed the fence posts. And in late September, when the wheat came off thin but clean, she had something that almost no one expected her to have. She had grain, 200 bushels of hard red spring wheat, 28 bushels of oats, 6 bushels of rye. It was not enough to make her comfortable. It was exactly enough to survive. Winter flour, spring seed, the interest payment to the bank, and feed for the one horse she had not sold. The math was tight. If she lost nothing, she would live. If she lost a third of it to rot, mice, or contamination, she would lose the claim by March. The grain sat in an old raised granary that had been built by the previous claim holder, a man who gave up after one season and sold to Ragna's husband for $12 and a promise. The floor planks were spaced unevenly. The south wall had warped where rain pooled against the foundation stones. The door hung on leather hinges that stretched in the cold. It was, by any honest measure, a box with gaps. And in Cass County, Dakota Territory, in the autumn of 1886, gaps were invitations. Hiram Pell arrived on the first Tuesday of October with a ledger book and a mouthful of conclusions. He was 58 years old, the grain elevator man for the district, and a former mill inspector who had spent 30 years deciding whether wheat was fit to buy. He did not knock. He walked the perimeter of the granary, ran his thumb along the south sill, crouched to look under the raised floor, and stood up with his lips pressed together so tightly they disappeared into his beard. Ragna watched from the soddy door. She had been grinding rye on a hand mill, and flour dust whitened her forearms to the elbows. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked out to meet him. Pell did not greet her. He pointed at the south wall. "That board has a 1/4-inch gap at the base. You see it?" Ragna saw it. She had seen it all summer. And that corner. He kicked the northeast post where the foundation stone had shifted. "You have got a finger-width opening behind that post, maybe more." "I stuffed rags in it," Ragna said. "Rags." Pell opened his ledger and wrote something without looking at her. "Mrs. Brekke." I have inspected 400 granaries in this territory. Rags do not stop rats. Rags feed rats. They pull the fibers for nesting material, and they come back for the grain. He walked to the door, lifted it on its sagging hinges, and looked at the interior. The wheat sacks sat on plank risers, 6 inches off the floor. The oat bin was a wooden box with a fitted lid. The rye occupied 2 smaller sacks near the back wall. It was organized. It was clean. It was also, by Pell's standards, completely inadequate. "You have maybe 200 bushels in here," he said. "Hard red spring, decent color. I would buy it today at 42 cents if you brought it clean to the elevator. But I will not advance you flour credit against grain stored like this." "Why not?" "Because you do not own wheat until you keep rats from owning it first." He closed the ledger. 3 things work: tin-lined bins, poison bait along the walls, and paid men to seal every joint in this building. You have any of those? Ragna had none. Tin sheeting cost more per square foot than she had earned all year. Strychnine bait meant dead rats in the walls and near her food. Hiring carpenters to seal the granary would cost nearly the value of the wheat inside it. She had calculated every option during the long summer evenings while the wheat was still in the field. Every number came back the same. She could not afford to protect the grain by any method Hiram Pell considered legitimate. "I will manage it," she said. Pell looked at her the way men look at women who say things that are not backed by money. "Mrs. Brekke, I have seen good wheat go bad in better barns than this. November rats come in packs. They do not nibble. They move in, they nest, they piss on everything they do not eat. 1 rat fouls more grain than 10 rats consume. You understand that?" She understood it. Her mother had taught her that before she could read. "Then you understand that managing it means money or materials, and you have neither." He tipped his hat, which was the only courtesy he offered. "Bring it to the elevator if you want to sell before the damage starts. 42 cents, clean delivery." He left. Ragna stood in the October wind and looked at her granary. Inside it sat everything she had. Outside it sat a world that would take it from her 1 gnawed sack at a time, 42 cents a bushel. She did the math standing there. 200 bushels at 42 cents was $84. The banknote required $31 in December. Spring seed would cost $18 if she bought it instead of saving her own. That left $35 for flour, feed, lamp oil, salt, and everything else between October and May. It was survivable, barely, but it meant selling now at the lowest autumn price, with no grain held back for a better spring market, and it meant trusting Hiram Pell's elevator, the same elevator where 3 farmers last year swore their grain was weighed light. Ragna did not sell. She went back inside the soddy, sat on the stool beside the hand mill, and pressed her floury palms against her closed eyes. She could feel the numbers like a weight on her chest. 200 bushels, $31 owed, 6 months of winter, 1 granary with gaps wide enough to slide a knife blade through. She had grain, she had time, she had no solution. The answer came on a Thursday, and it came from behind a livery stable. Ragna had walked to town, 3 miles each way, because the horse was needed for hauling, to look at second-hand traps at the hardware store. The traps cost 15 cents each for the small spring models and 35 cents for the larger ones. She needed at least 20 to cover the granary's perimeter. That was $4.50 she did not have for equipment that experienced trappers told her would catch the first wave and miss the rest. Rats learned. They avoided new metal. The traps would work for a week and then become furniture. She was walking past the livery on her way home, empty-handed, when she heard the sound. A high, compressed shriek, followed by a thump against wood, and then silence. She stopped. Behind the stable, In the narrow alley between the livery wall and the feed store's refuse pile, 3 cats had pinned a rat against a broken barrel stave. The rat was large, brown-furred, thick-bodied, the kind that lived under grain platforms and grew fat on spilled oats. It had tried to run along the barrel edge, and the first cat, a gray, torn-eared Tom, had knocked it to the ground. The second cat blocked the gap toward the street. The third sat on the barrel itself, watching with the patient focus of something that had done this before. The rat fainted left. The gray Tom struck with one paw and sent it spinning. The rat tried to flatten itself against the wall. The second cat closed the distance. It was over in 4 seconds. The gray Tom bit down behind the skull, shook once, and dropped the body. None of the cats touched the grain sacks stacked against the feed store wall. They did not claw at the burlap. They did not sniff the spilled oats in the dirt. They killed the rat, left the body, and moved along the alley in single file, looking for the next thing that moved. Ragna stood very still in the street and watched them go. She thought about Hiram Pell's 3 solutions: tin, poison, hired men. She thought about the traps she could not afford. And then she thought about her mother, standing in a cold storeroom in Hallingdal, pressing Ragna's child hand against the iron hinge of a grain chest and saying, in Norwegian, the sentence Ragna had carried across the Atlantic without knowing she would need it. The rat does not beat the cat. The rat beats the gap. Her mother had not meant that cats alone would save grain. She had meant that the rat's advantage was architecture, not appetite. Rats did not overpower storage. They found the openings. They exploited the seams. A cat in a sealed room was useless because the rats never entered. A cat in a room full of gaps was useless because the rats had too many escape routes. But a cat in a room with controlled gaps, uzvanins, narrow lanes, exposed crossings, predictable paths, that was a different equation. Ragna walked home faster than she had walked to town. The idea took shape over 2 days of drawing lines in the dirt floor of the soddy with a stick. Ragna did not write well in English, but she could sketch, and she drew the granary from above, the 4 walls, the door, the internal bin dividers, the loft, the foundation stones. She marked every gap she knew: the south wall warp, the northeast post, the hinge side of the door, the place where the floor planks did not meet behind the oat bin. Then she drew a second version. In this version, the grain bins were sealed, not with tin, which she could not afford, but with tight-fitted boards, weighted lids, and flattened metal scrap over every gnawed corner. The bins became boxes inside the building. Between the bins and the outer walls, she drew narrow aisles, 6 inches to a foot wide, running the full perimeter. These aisles were the killing ground. Any rat that entered the granary through the remaining gaps, and some gaps would remain because she could not seal a warped building perfectly, would find itself in a narrow lane between a solid bin wall and the outer wall. The lane offered no food, no nesting material, no shelter, just a long, exposed corridor where anything that moved could be seen and caught by something faster. The cats would live in the loft. They would descend through cat holes cut into the aisle walls. They would patrol the lanes at night when the rats moved. The rats would face a choice: cross open ground to reach sealed bins they could not easily enter, or retreat through the gaps they came in. Either way, they moved through space controlled by predators. It was not a perfect system. It was a system that tilted the odds. Ragna calculated what she needed: cats, as many as she could find, feral enough to hunt, cheap enough to buy in volume. Scrap metal, stovepipe, lard tins, any flat iron she could flatten and tack over corners. Boards, enough to seal the bins and frame the aisles. Nails, 2 pounds, maybe 3. Ash and flour. for tracking lines to read rodent movement, water pans, to keep the cats anchored to the loft instead of wandering off. Total cost she could not avoid, $5 for the cats if she bought them cheap. Another dollar for nails and scrap. Everything else she could scavenge, borrow, or pull from the soddy. $6 against the loss of the farm. Agnes Rourke lived on the next claim east, a quarter-mile across open prairie. She was 36, Irish-born, married to a man who worked the bonanza farms during harvest and drank the wages in Fargo during winter. She had 4 children, a sod house slightly larger than Ragna's and the sharpest tongue in the township. Agnes arrived on Saturday morning uninvited, carrying a jar of pickled beets as a reason to visit and a full inventory of questions as her actual purpose. "I heard you bought cats," Agnes said, setting the beets on the table. "From the rail yard, feral ones." "I bought 40, Ragna said. Agnes sat down. 40. 12.5 cents each, $5 total. $5. Agnes looked at the soddy as if reassessing the financial judgment of its occupant. For animals that bite, carry fleas, and foul everything they touch. "They do not foul grain," Ragna said. "They foul corners. I'm not putting them in the grain." "Then where?" Ragna explained the system. The sealed bins, the narrow aisles, the cat holes from the loft, the ash tracking lines. Agnes listened with the expression of someone watching a neighbor dig a well in a swamp. Not hostile, but deeply unconvinced. "Ragna," Agnes said, and her voice dropped the way it did when she was about to say something she believed was kind. "I have 4 children. My youngest is 2. I know what it is to be desperate, and I know what it is to grab the first idea that looks like a rope. But cats are not a rope. Cats are cats. They foul what they cannot eat. They fight at night. They carry disease. You put 40 of them in a building with your grain, and by December you will not have a rat problem. You will have a cat problem." "The cats will not touch the grain," Ragna said. "The bins are sealed." "Sealed with what? Boards and bent tin?" "Ragna, a determined cat can claw through a flour sack in 30 seconds. I have watched mine do it." "These are not house cats. They are ferals. They hunt. They do not scavenge bins." Agnes shook her head. "You are betting your winter on the good behavior of 40 animals you bought for 12 cents apiece out of flour sacks and alley gutters." She was not wrong. That was exactly what Ragna was doing. And sitting in the soddy, watching Agnes's face, Ragna felt the doubt that had lived in her chest since the livery alley rise up and press against her ribs. What if the cats tore into the wheat? What if they fought so viciously they destroyed the bins? What if they simply left 40 feral creatures with no loyalty to a stranger who had stuffed them in crates and hauled them to a prairie claim? But the alternative was Hiram Pell's 42 cents. The alternative was selling now, taking the low price, and hoping $35 would stretch from October to May. The alternative was giving up the only advantage she had, grain in hand, stored on her own land, under her own control. "Agnes," Ragna said, "I cannot afford tin. I cannot afford poison. I cannot afford carpenters. I can afford cats." Agnes took her pickled beets back when she left. She did not say goodbye, but at the door she turned and said, "When the cats ruin your oats, bring the children. We will find room." It was the kindest threat Ragna had received all autumn. Lowell Cady owned the general store and the only reliable supply of rodent poison in the district. He was 42, born in Vermont, and had come to Dakota Territory not to farm, but to sell things to people who did. He stocked strychnine bait in waxed paper packets, spring traps in 3 sizes, and sheet tin by the running foot. In a season when rats were moving into every granary in the county, Katie stood to profit from every farmer's fear. A woman solving the rat problem with $5 worth of alley cats was bad for business. Katie came to Ragna's claim on a Monday, accompanied by Hiram Pell and the township deputy, a slow-moving man named Farber who had been told there was a nuisance complaint. The three men stood outside the granary in a line, like judges at a county fair for disasters. "You can hear them from the road," Katie said. He was not wrong. The cats had been in the loft for 4 days, and the sound at dusk was extraordinary. 40 feral animals finding hierarchy in a confined space. The yowling carried across the flat prairie like a dispute between demons. "Mrs. Brekke." Farber spoke as if reading from a card he had memorized. "I have received a complaint regarding animal nuisance and potential disease risk from the accumulation of feral cats on your property. I am here to assess." "Assess what?" Ragna said. "The conditions." "The conditions are that I have cats in my grain loft and rats in my county. Which one is the nuisance?" Katie stepped forward. He was taller than Ragna by a full head, and he used the height. "The nuisance is 40 diseased animals crammed into a building where food is stored. You are creating a health risk for the entire district. Feral cats carry fleas. Fleas carry fever. One outbreak and every farm within 5 miles is affected." "The cats are in the loft," Ragna said. "The grain is in sealed bins below. The cats do not enter the bins." "Open it," Katie said to Farber. "Open the door and let us see." Ragna opened the door herself. She lifted the lantern from its nail and held it so the light fell across the interior. The grain bins were visible, rough-boarded boxes with weighted stone lids, flour sacks arranged on raised planks. Between the bins and the walls ran the narrow aisles she had framed. The ash line along the main threshold was undisturbed. No cat prints in the grain area, no droppings on the bin lids. Above, in the loft, the cats shuffled and hissed. One pair of yellow eyes reflected the lantern light and disappeared. Sadie looked at the interior for a long time. Then he stepped to the nearest bin and kicked the threshold where the floor met the wall. Claw marks scored the outer aisle boards, the cats patrolling their lanes. "That is not farming," Katie said. "That is a circus." "It is pest control," Ragna said. "It is a woman too poor to buy proper solutions pretending that alley vermin are the same as a sealed barn." Katie turned to Farber. "Write it up. If one cat crosses onto my property or any property in this district, I will file for destruction of the animals and a lien on this claim for public health damages." Ragna looked at him. She looked at Pell, who studied his ledger and said nothing. She looked at Farber, who was writing slowly in a small notebook. "Mr. Katie," she said. Her voice was level. "You sell poison at 30 cents a packet. You sell traps at 35 cents each. You sell tin at 12 cents a running foot. Every rat in this county puts money in your store. Stop selling poison long enough to watch where the rats are going. They are not going into my granary. Check yours." Katie's face went dark. He turned and walked to his wagon without answering. Pell followed, his ledger under his arm. Farber looked at Ragna, looked at the granary, wrote one more line, and left. Ragna closed the door. She leaned against it in the dark. Above her, 40 feral cats settled into their uneasy loft truce. Outside, the October wind carried the first real bite of the season that would decide everything. She had made an enemy who wanted her to fail. She had a neighbor who expected her to fail. She had an elevator man who had given her a deadline without saying so. And she had 6 months of winter sitting in wooden boxes behind a door that shook when the wind blew. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been laughed at for building something other people did not understand? The work began the next morning, before dawn. Ragna started with the south wall, the worst gap. She had collected scrap metal for a week, 2 pieces of ruined stovepipe from the dump behind the livery, a stack of flattened lard tins she bought for 8 cents from a woman who saved them for patching, and a sheet of tin that had once been the bottom of a milk pail. None of it was large enough to cover the full warp. All of it, layered and tacked, could narrow the opening from a 1/4 inch to something a rat might attempt, but not pass through easily. She worked with a claw hammer and cut nails, tacking the tin scraps over the warp from the outside. Tolliff had not arrived yet. She would not meet him for 3 more days, and so she worked alone, on her knees in cold mud, bending metal with her bare hands because her only pair of work gloves had a hole in the right thumb that made gripping nails impossible. By noon, the south wall gap was covered. Not sealed, covered. The difference mattered. A sealed gap stopped rats entirely. A covered gap slowed them, forced them to work, gave them time to be heard, seen, or intercepted. Ragna was not building a fortress. She was building a delay. She moved to the northeast post. The foundation stone had shifted during the summer rains, opening a gap between the post base and the ground. She could not move the stone. It weighed more than she did. Instead, she dug a shallow trench around the post base, filled it with packed clay and gravel, and tacked a collar of stovepipe around the post itself, 18 inches high. A rat could still dig. But digging took time, and time was what the cats turned into dead rats. The first 3 days were the hardest. She worked from first light until she could not see her hands. She ate cold biscuits at the granary door. She hauled water to the loft twice a day, climbing a ladder with a bucket in one hand and a stick in the other, because 2 of the toms would swipe at anything that came through the loft hatch. By the 3rd evening, her hands were cut in 4 places. Her back ached from crouching, and she had patched 6 gaps, reinforced 2 bin lids, and framed the first 12 feet of aisle-board along the east wall. 7 cats escaped on the 3rd day. 2 came back at dusk carrying dead mice, which Ragna took as evidence of employment. The other 5 vanished into the prairie and did not return. That left 35 cats. 35 was fewer than 40. Every number mattered. 1 tom shio, the largest, a scarred orange animal with half a left ear, tore Ragna's sleeve when she reached past him to set a water pan. His claws went through the wool and into her forearm. She bled into the pan and had to dump it and refill. The tom watched from the rafter with an expression that suggested he would do it again. Rain came on the 4th day. Heavy, cold, late-season rain that swelled the south door in its frame and reopened the gap she had just covered. Water ran under the door sill and pooled against the lowest grain sacks. Ragna pulled the sacks back, restacked them on higher risers built from scrap planks, and spent the afternoon rehammering the south wall tin while rain ran down her neck and into her boots. That night, she found fresh gnaw marks behind a patched board on the west wall. A rat had chewed through wet wood beside her newest tin patch, entering the outer aisle. It had not reached the bins, but it had gotten inside the building. Ragna sat on the granary floor in the dark, listening to the cats move above her, and counted what she had. 35 cats, 6 patched gaps, 12 feet of aisle framing, 200 bushels of wheat that smelled clean and dry, and 7 weeks, maybe 8, before the hard freeze drove every field rat in the county toward the nearest warm building with food inside. She pressed her cut hands together. The blood had dried in the lines of her palms. Above her, something small and fast scratched along the outer wall, testing the edge of the tin. The race had started, and the rats were already running. Tolliff Moen arrived on the 7th evening, and he arrived because of the noise. He was 61 years old, Norwegian-born, and he walked with a limp that came from a warehouse loading dock in Duluth, where a grain cart had rolled over his left foot 9 years earlier. He was missing the last two fingers of his right hand. The same accident, the same cart, the same moment of inattention that had turned him from a working millwright's helper into a man who wandered west because standing still reminded him of what standing still had cost. He had worked as a night watchman in a Duluth grain warehouse for 6 years before the injury. Before that, he had helped build and repair grain elevators along the Lake Superior shore. He knew wood, he knew grain, and he knew rats the way a man knows an enemy. He has watched every night for half a decade. He heard the cats from the road. The sound carried across the flat October prairie in a way that Ragna had stopped noticing. 40 animals establishing territory produces a constant low yowl punctuated by sharp hisses and the occasional scream of a tom asserting dominance. To Ragna, it was the sound of her investment. To anyone passing on the section road, it was the sound of a woman who had lost her judgment. Tollef came to laugh. He told her that later, and she believed him, because the first thing he did was stand at the corner of the granary with his hands in his coat pockets and shake his head like a man watching a barn fire. He could not stop. But then he stopped shaking his head. He stopped because he saw the ash. Ragna had sprinkled a line of wood ash along the exterior sill of the south wall that morning, a thin, even stripe the width of a knife blade running from the corner post to the door frame. It was a technique her mother had used in Norway. Ash on the threshold showed tracks. If a rat crossed the line, its feet left prints in the powder. If nothing crossed, the ash stayed smooth. It was a way of reading movement without being present. It was a way of knowing. Tollef looked at the ash line. He looked at Ragna, who was standing barefoot in the frost-stiffened mud because her boots were drying inside the soddy after the previous day's rain. He looked at the ash line again. "Who taught you to read tracks?" he asked. "A woman who never lost rye," Ragna said. Tollef stayed. He did not offer help the way men usually offered help to widows, with a tone of charity and an expectation of gratitude. He offered help the way one craftsman offers help to another who is attempting something ambitious with insufficient tools. He saw the design. He saw the logic. He saw the gaps in the logic, and he told her about them without pretending she was incapable of understanding. "Your aisles are too wide on the east side," he said on the first morning, crouching in the granary with a piece of charcoal marking the floor. "A rat in a foot-wide lane has a room to dodge. You want 8 inches, maybe 6. Narrow enough that a cat's reach covers the full width. The rat has nowhere to go except through the cat." Ragna looked at the east aisle. She had framed it at 12 inches because she needed space to walk through for inspections. "You walk through before dusk," Tollef said. "You inspect with a lantern. Then you close it down. At night, the aisles belong to the cats. During the day, they belong to you. You do not share the space at the same time." He taught her 3 things in the first week, and each one changed the system. The first lesson was reading rodent pressure. Ash lines were the beginning, but Tollef showed her what else to look for. Gnaw marks at a consistent height, 4 to 6 inches off the floor, indicated brown rats, the dominant species in the region. Grease smears along baseboards showed established runs, paths the rats used repeatedly and marked with oil from their fur. Droppings near corners meant nesting exploration. Droppings in the middle of open floor meant a rat so confident it did not bother hiding. Each sign told her where to focus, where to reinforce, and where to place the cat's access points. "You do not set a cat where you think the rat might go," Tollef said. "You set a cat where the rat has already been. The grease tells you, the ash tells you, the gnaw height tells you. A rat is a creature of habit. It runs the same path until something kills it on that path." The second lesson was exclusion from the outside. Ragna had been patching gaps from the interior, tacking tin over openings she could reach from inside the granary. Tolef showed her why this was backward, a rat testing a new entry point pushed inward. If the patch was on the inside, the rat's pressure worked against the fastening, pushing the tin away from the wood. If the patch was on the outside, the rat pushed the tin tighter against the frame. "Always close the door from the side the enemy pushes," Tolef said. He pulled one of Ragna's interior patches off with his three-fingered hand, took it outside, and re-nailed it from the exterior, the same piece of scrap tin, the same nails. But now the physics worked in Ragna's favor. They spent 2 days moving every interior patch to the outside. Ragna's hands, already cut and swollen, cracked open again in the cold. Tolef worked beside her without comment. His three-fingered grip on the hammer was slow but precise, each nail seated in 3 strokes where Ragna needed 5. The third lesson was cat management. Tolef had watched ship cats in Duluth Harbor and warehouse cats in the grain terminals. The cats that hunted best were cats that had a reason to stay and a reason to hunt. Water was the anchor. A cat with a reliable water source in the loft would not wander far. Shelter was the second anchor. The loft was warm, dry, and elevated, which cats preferred. But food was the variable. Feed the cats inside the grain room, and they became lazy, fat, and useless. Feed them nothing, and they left to hunt elsewhere. The balance was to provide just enough outside the grain bins, scraps, milk if available, the organs of butchered chickens, to keep them anchored, while leaving the rats as the primary food source inside the aisles. "You are not feeding cats," Tolef said. "You are managing hunters. A hunter with a full belly watches. A hunter with an empty belly leaves. A hunter with a half-full belly kills anything that moves past its post." Ragna adjusted. She stopped putting table scraps inside the loft and instead placed them in a shallow pan outside the granary door at dusk so the cats came down to eat, then returned to the loft, then hunted the aisles through the night. The rhythm established itself within 3 days. By the end of the first week with Tolef, the cats were moving in a pattern, loft by day, scraps at dusk, aisles at night. The construction continued through the second and third weeks of October. Ragna and Tolef worked together from first light until dark, rebuilding the granary's interior around the system Ragna had designed and Tolef refined. They raised the lowest grain sacks off the floor on scrap planks, adding a second layer of risers so the bottom sack sat 8 inches above the boards instead of 6. They tacked flattened tin over every gnawed corner, lard tins, coffee tins, one piece of a ruined wash basin that Tolef cut with tin snips borrowed from the blacksmith. They hung lath strips from the rafters to create an elevated walkway for the cats, running above the aisles so the animals could move from one end of the granary to the other without touching the grain bins. They built 2 sliding panels, thin boards set in grooved frames, that allowed cats to pass from the loft into the outer aisles, but could be closed if Ragna needed to work inside without 35 feral animals underfoot. Each bin lid was reinforced with a crossboard and weighted with a flat stone. Ragna cut the stones herself from a field stone pile behind the soddy, splitting them with a cold chisel and hammer until they were flat enough to sit level. The oat bin received a double lid, an inner board sealed with lard pressed into the seams, and an outer board weighted with stone. A rat could gnaw through 1 lid. It could not gnaw through 2 while being hunted from above. At each door, they set a shallow box filled with sand. The sand served the same purpose as the ash lines, tracks, but lasted longer in the wind. Ragna checked the sand trays every morning before dawn, reading the night story in the prints. Cat tracks, heavy and round. Rat tracks, if present, smaller and 5-toed, with a tail drag between them. By the end of the second week, she could tell which cats were hunting the east aisle and which preferred the west by the size and spacing of their prints. Tollef's ribs hurt him. He did not say so, but Ragna saw him press his hand against his left side when he bent to nail a patch, and she saw him straighten slowly, the way men straighten when their bodies are arguing with their intentions. He was 61. He had a limp. He had 3 fingers on his right hand. He worked beside her anyway because he had recognized something in the ash line on the first evening, and whatever he had recognized was enough to make the work his own. Setbacks came in clusters. On the 12th day, rain returned. Not the heavy October rain of the first week, but a cold, persistent drizzle that lasted 3 days and swelled every board in the granary. The south door, already rehung with new leather hinges Tollef had cut from a worn harness strap, warped again. A gap opened at the base. Not the quarter-inch warp that Hiram Pell had condemned, but a new gap, narrower, along the hinge side where the leather stretched in the wet. Ragna discovered it at dawn when the sand tray showed rat tracks entering the building for the first time in 4 days. She patched the hinge gap with a strip of tin bent double and hammered flat. The next morning, the sand showed no new tracks. But the rain continued, and each day brought a new swollen board, a new shifted plank, a new place where the building's old joints opened under moisture. Ragna began carrying the hammer in her apron pocket at all times, ready to drive a nail at the first sign of a new gap. On the 15th day, Katie's sabotage began. It was not dramatic, it was petty, which made it worse. 2 boys from town, Ragna never learned whether Katie paid them or simply encouraged them, came to the claim at midday while Ragna was hauling water from the creek. They did not open the granary door. They opened the loft hatch. By the time Ragna returned, 4 cats had escaped through the hatch and scattered into the open prairie. 1 came back. 3 did not. 32 cats. Tollef found the loft hatch open and the stick that propped it, a stick Ragna had not placed there, still wedged in the frame. He pulled it out and handed it to Ragna without a word. They both knew. They could not prove it. Ragna fashioned a latch for the hatch from a bent nail and a strip of leather. It would not stop a determined adult, but it would slow a boy long enough to be heard. On the 18th day, the cold arrived in earnest. The first true frost of the season came overnight, hard enough to ice the water pans in the loft and kill the last grass along the section road. Ragna broke the ice with her knuckle at dawn and refilled the pans with water she carried in a tin bucket, climbing the ladder one-handed, while the orange Tom with half an ear watched from the rafter and did not swipe. He had stopped swiping a week earlier. She did not know if this was respect, habit, or simply indifference. She took it. The frost changed the rat equation. Tollef had warned her it would. As long as the fields held warmth and the stubble offered cover, the rats had options. They could live outside, feeding on waste grain, burrowing into manure piles, nesting under abandoned equipment. But the frost killed the field. It hardened the burrow entrances. It drove every rodent in the district toward the nearest structure with grain inside. Ragna checked the sand trays on the morning after the first hard frost and found what she expected. The south tray showed 3 sets of rat tracks entering. 2 sets showed the rats turning and leaving, driven back by something in the aisle. The 3rd set showed a rat entering, moving 6 inches along the wall and stopping. No exit tracks. No return tracks. She found the body behind the east aisle board, a brown rat full grown with a bite wound behind the skull. The gray Tom, the one she had first seen at the livery, sat on the lath walkway above the spot, cleaning his paws. Tollef looked at the body and the sand tray and the single set of tracks. 1 rat, first night of frost, he said. Count the neighbors' trays and you would find 50. Ragna did not count the neighbors' trays. She counted her own. Each morning, each tray, each track. Hiram Pell returned on the 20th day, unannounced as was his custom. He walked the perimeter again. He noted the exterior patches, the tin collars around the posts, the new hinge on the south door. He crouched and looked at the sand tray. He did not touch it. "You have had work done," he said. "I have done work," Ragna said. Pell looked at Tollef, who was sitting on an upturned bucket, whittling a replacement latch pin for the loft hatch. "And you brought in help." "He is not hired. He is here." Pell opened his ledger. "Mrs. Brekke, I will tell you what I told you 3 weeks ago. Cats do not replace tin. Cats do not replace sealed joints. Cats do not replace a proper built granary with a concrete foundation and zinc-lined bins." "I do not have concrete or zinc," Ragna said. "That is exactly my point." He made a note in the ledger. "The grain inside this building is clean today. I can see that. But today is October. Today there are 50 rats in this county for everyone that has tested your barn. By January there will be 500, and 500 rats do not care about cats or ash lines or tin patches. They care about gaps, and this building has gaps." "Fewer than 3 weeks ago," Ragna said. "Fewer is not none." Pell closed the ledger. "My offer stands. 42 cents, clean delivery. Drops to 38 in November." He left. Ragna looked at Tollef. Tollef looked at the sand tray. "He is not wrong about January," Tollef said. "I know. 500 is not 50. I know that too. Then we had better count the gaps again." They counted. Tollef found 2 that Ragna had missed: a hairline split in a floor plank near the oat bin, and a place where the roof boards met the wall plate with enough space for a young rat to squeeze through. They patched both before dark. The tally, as best they could measure, 41 openings found and covered since the work began. An unknown number remained. Every building had openings that no one could see, hidden behind boards, underground, in the joints between frame and foundation. The question was not whether rats could find a way in. The question was whether the way in led to the grain or to the cats. By the 1st of November, the granary held a working system. 32 cats occupied the loft, descending through the sliding panels at dusk to patrol the outer aisles. The grain bins, wheat, oats, rye, sat in sealed boxes with weighted double lids, raised 8 inches off the floor on plank risers. Every known gap in the exterior was patched with scrap tin, bent iron, or packed clay. Ash lines ran along the interior sills. Sand trays sat inside each door. A chalkboard, a piece of slate Tollef had found in the schoolhouse refuse, hung on the inside of the main door. Ragna wrote on it each morning: the date, the number of fresh tracks near the wheat, and the number of rat bodies found. October 29th. Tracks near wheat, none. Bodies found, 2. Outery style. October 30th. Tracks near wheat, none. Bodies found, 1. South wall. October 31st. Tracks near wheat, none. Bodies found, none. November 1st. Tracks near wheat, none for 3 nights. Bodies found, 1, under lath walkway. The numbers told a story that Ragna read each morning with the careful attention of a woman whose entire life depended on the next line. No fresh tracks at the wheat. No gnaw marks on the bin lids. No droppings inside the bins. The cats were not touching the grain. They had no reason to, because the bins were sealed and the rats provided food. The rats were not reaching the grain. They had no path to, because the gaps were covered and the aisles were patrolled. The system was working. But working against scattered autumn rats and working against what was coming were different things entirely. Tollef said it plainly one evening, sitting by Ragna's soddy stove with a cup of weak coffee. You have built a good barn for October. January will tell you whether it is a good barn for winter. Agnes said it less gently when she came by to return a borrowed needle. Your cats are eating field rats. Wait until the field is frozen and see what pushes in from every direction. And Hiram Pell said it through absence. He stopped visiting. He stopped offering 42 cents. His silence was its own kind of verdict. He was waiting, the way a man waits for a building to burn when he has already decided it will. November broke the prairie open. The warm autumn that had lingered through October ended on the 8th of November with a wind shift that brought Canadian air down across the Red River Valley in a wall of cold that farmers could feel in their teeth. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in a single day. Puddles froze before noon. The creek that fed Ragna's water supply crusted over. Ice formed on the inside of the soddy windows by morning. Ragna hauled water to the loft cats twice a day now, breaking ice from the pans with her knuckles so hard it bled. The cats pressed together for warmth in the loft, a mass of fur and muscle that generated its own heat. At dusk, they descended into the aisles and hunted with an intensity that Ragna could hear from inside the soddy. The scratch of claws on wood, the compressed squeal of a caught rat, the thump of a body hitting the floor. The sand trays told the story of the freeze. On November 9th, 7 sets of rat tracks entered the south door gap, a gap Rana had patched 3 times, but that kept opening as the cold contracted the wood. 5 sets showed entry and immediate retreat. 2 showed entry and termination, no return tracks, which meant dead rats. On November 10th, 11 sets entered. On the 11th, 14, the field rats were coming. The frozen prairie offered nothing. Every warm structure with grain became a target, and Ragna's granary was no different from any other farm building in the district, except that her granary had 32 predators living inside it, and a woman who read the sand trays each morning like scripture. Tollef helped her repatch the south door gap a 4th time, this time driving a wooden shim into the hinge side and nailing a double layer of tin across the base. "This will hold until January," he said. "After that, the wood will move again." "Then I will patch it in January," Ragna said. "You will be patching everything in January." The hard winter announced itself in the last week of November. Snow came on the 23rd, not the dusting that Dakota farmers expected, but a full storm driven by northern wind that buried the section roads under 2 feet of white and did not stop for 36 hours. Rail movement along the Northern Pacific line slowed and then halted as drifts covered the tracks between Fargo and the western towns. The grain elevator in town closed its doors because no trains could carry the wheat away. With the rails frozen, imported flour stopped arriving. Families who had already sold their grain at autumn prices, Pell's 42 cents or worse, found themselves dependent on store-bought flour from Katie's shelves. Katie raised the price. $1.10 for a 25-pound sack, then $1.30 by December. The families who had kept their own grain grounded at home or paid the mill. The families who had sold had no grain to grind. And the rats came for what remained. They came not as scouts, the tentative single-track visitors of October and early November, but as populations. Entire colonies displaced from frozen fields, collapsed burrows, snow-covered refuse heaps. They moved toward warmth and food with the blind pressure of water seeking a drain. Every granary, every barn, every soddy with a sack of flour under the bed became a target. The first farmer to discover the scale of the problem was a man named Decker, 4 miles south. He opened his granary door on the morning of December 2nd and found the floor alive. Brown rats covered the base of his grain sacks in a moving carpet. They had entered through the foundation. His building sat on the ground, not on raised stones, and they had been inside for days. The sacks nearest the walls were gnawed through. The grain inside was mixed with droppings, urine stains, and nesting material. The smell hit him before the sight did. Sour, acrid, the smell of contamination that meant the grain was no longer safely edible. Dekker lost 40 bushels in that single discovery. Not eaten. Contaminated. The rats had consumed perhaps 5 bushels. They had ruined 35 more. By the second week of December, 3 more farms reported the same. Sacks torn, grain fouled. Families opening bins they had trusted to find the contents swarming with rodents or reeking of the ammonia stench that meant urine had soaked through. The problem was not consumption. A single rat ate half a pound of grain per day. The problem was contamination. A single rat could soil 10 times what it ate. 100 rats in a granary for a week could render hundreds of pounds of grain unfit for milling, unfit for bread, unfit for anything except burning. Hiram Pell posted a notice at the elevator. Any grain brought for sale or storage must be inspected for contamination. Sacks with visible damage, odor, or droppings would be refused. The notice meant that farmers who had lost clean grain had lost more than food. They had lost currency. They could not sell what they could not keep clean. Okay. The crisis came to Ragna's door on the night of December 14th. The temperature had been falling for 3 days. The thermometer on Pell's elevator read 19 degrees below zero at noon. At night, it dropped further. How far, no one measured, but the cold was the kind that cracked fence posts and froze the water in a bucket within an hour of being set down. The snow that had fallen in November was now a permanent layer, compacted and wind-crusted, covering the fields in a white sheet that offered rats nothing. No food, no shelter, no warmth. Everything that could move had moved indoors. Ragna heard them at dusk. Not the cats. The rats. She was inside the soddy heating water on the stove for the loft pans when she heard a sound along the south wall of the granary that was different from the usual scratching. It was dense, layered, not one animal testing an edge, but many animals pressing against a surface at once. She took the lantern and walked to the granary in boots she had to kick ice from before she could lace them. The south wall tin held. She could see the metal vibrating slightly in the lantern light, the pressure of bodies on the other side pushing against the patches, testing every edge. She checked the sand tray inside the south door. Tracks. More tracks than she had ever recorded. Entry tracks, exit tracks, some that circled and returned, some that stopped mid-tray where a cat had intercepted. She counted the distinct trail lines and gave up at 20. Inside the aisles, the cats were hunting. She could hear them, not yowling now, but working. Short, sharp sounds. The thump of weight hitting wood, the compressed squeal that ended in silence, the scratch of claws dragging a body away from the patrol lane. The lath walkway above the aisles trembled with movement. Shadows passed across the lantern beam. Night 1, the south wall held. The tin corners held. The bin lids, weighted with stone, showed scratches on the outer surfaces, but no penetration. Ragna found 9 rat bodies in the aisles at dawn. 9 kills in one night. The sand tray showed dozens of entries. Most had been turned back or terminated. The wheat was untouched. Night 2. The cold deepened. The cats were no longer hunting individually. They gathered along the warmest wall, the west side, which caught the late afternoon sun, and waited in groups of 4 and 5. When rats entered the aisles, the cats drove them toward the dead-end corners where the aisle framing met the exterior wall. Ragna found 14 bodies at dawn. The ash line inside the main wheat bin showed no disturbance, no prints, no grease marks, no droppings. Night 3, a complication. Agnes Rourke came to the door at first light, her youngest child wrapped in a blanket against her chest. The child was hot with fever. Agnes's face was gray. "He ate meal from the barrel," Agnes said. "The barrel in the corner. I checked it 2 days ago, and it was clean. Last night I found droppings in the bottom layer. He had eaten porridge from it yesterday morning." Ragna looked at the child. His skin was flushed, his breathing shallow. He was 2 years old. "Have you seen the doctor?" "The doctor is in Fargo. The roads are closed." Agnes stood in Ragna's doorway with a sick child and a contaminated food supply and nowhere else to go. Behind her, the prairie stretched flat and white and empty in every direction, and the nearest help was 3 miles of snow-packed road away in a town where the stores sold poisoned bait and the elevator man kept a ledger of other people's losses. Ragni brought Agnes inside. She boiled water. She made broth from a bone she had been saving. She did not say what she was thinking, which was that rat-contaminated meal could carry sickness that broth could not cure. She did not say what she was calculating, which was that every cup of clean grain she gave Agnes was a cup subtracted from her own winter margin. She gave Agnes clean flour, 5 pounds measured from her own sealed bin, open with the stone lid and the lard seal, and the inner board removed 1 layer at a time. The flour smelled like wheat. Just wheat. No sourness. No ammonia. Agnes held the bag and looked at Ragna as if she had handed her a piece of something she did not know still existed. On the same day, Tullif slipped on the ice threshold of the granary while carrying a water bucket to the loft. His bad leg, the one the grain cart had crushed in Duluth, went out from under him on the frozen step, and he fell against the door frame with the full weight of his body on his left side. Ragna heard the crack from inside the soddy. When she reached him, he was sitting on the frozen ground with his arms wrapped around his ribs and his face the color of old snow. "Cracked," he said. "Maybe 2." Ragna helped him to the soddy. He could walk, but he could not bend, and he could not lift his left arm above his waist. Climbing the ladder to the loft was impossible. Carrying water was impossible. Hammering, crouching, patching, all of it was done for him, at least for weeks. Ragna now had a sick neighbor's child in her soddy, an injured mentor on her spare blanket, 32 cats that needed water twice a day, a granary under siege from a regional rat population driven indoors by the worst cold in recent memory, and a decision to make. Keep every grain of clean wheat for herself, or begin sharing with the people who had laughed at her. She did not make the decision that night. She hauled water to the loft alone, climbing the ladder with the bucket in one hand and the lantern hooked on her elbow. The orange Tom watched from the rafter. She set the pan down, broke the ice crust from the morning's water with her knuckle, and stood in the dark loft listening to the cats move below her in the aisles. Hunting, killing, doing exactly what she had paid $5 for them to do. Night 4, the hinge gap. She found it at dawn in the sand tray, a set of tracks that did not follow the usual entry and retreat pattern. These tracks entered through the south door side, not the base, which was patched, but the hinge side, where the leather had stretched again in the cold. The tracks crossed the south tray, entered the east aisle, and turned toward the oat bin. Ragna followed the trail with the lantern. The ash line along the oat bin's outer wall was smeared. Something had pressed against it. She moved the lantern to the oat bin lid and saw the marks. Fresh claw scratches on the inner side of the outer board. A rat had reached the bin. It had tried to gnaw through the lid. The double lid system had stopped it. The inner board with its lard-sealed seams showed no damage. But the rat had reached the bin. Her hands shook, not from cold, from the knowledge that one stretched hinge, one gap she had missed in the dark, had allowed a rat to bypass the entire aisle system and reach the grain. If the lid had been single board, as it was before Tolliff taught her to double it, the rat would have gnawed through by morning. The oats would be contaminated, 30 bushels of horse feed ruined. She patched the hinge gap with a flattened coffee tin while the cats fought below the floorboards. She hammered it with fingers so cold she could not feel the nail heads. She bent the tin around the hinge leather and drove 4 nails through it into the door frame. When she finished, the gap was sealed. But the seal was metal on leather on wood in a building that moved with every temperature change, and she knew, with the certainty of a woman who had been patching gaps for 7 weeks, that the cold would open another one. If you are invested in this story, hit subscribe and stay with us, because what they see inside that wheat bin changes the whole town. The proof came the following morning. Agnes stood at the granary door with Hiram Pell behind her. Pell had not been invited. He had come because Agnes told him, on the road into town, that Ragna Brekke still had clean grain. Pell did not believe it. He had spent 3 weeks watching every other farmer in the district lose sacks to contamination, and he had decided, in the way that men decide things they have not verified, that Ragna's system had surely failed by now. Ragna opened the main wheat bin. She lifted the stone weight. She removed the outer board. She pulled back the inner board with its large seal intact. The wheat sat in the bin, as it had sat since September, dry, golden brown, smelling of nothing but grain. The ash line inside the bin, a thin stripe Ragna had placed around the interior edge of the floor, was unbroken. No tracks, no disturbance, no droppings, no grease smears, no gnaw marks on the inner walls. 200 bushels of hard red spring wheat, minus what Ragna had ground for her own flour and the 5 pounds she had given Agnes. Clean, whole, untouched. Pell stood at the bin and looked at the wheat for a long time. He looked at the lard seal on the inner lid. He looked at the stone weight. He looked at the ash line. He looked up at the lath walkway, where 3 cats sat watching him, with the flat golden stare of animals that had been killing things all night and did not care about his ledger. He did not say anything for a full minute. Then he said, "I told you cats were noise. I should have been looking at the gaps." Agnes looked at the wheat. She looked at Ragna. Her youngest child was still feverish, carried on her hip. Her flour supply was contaminated. Her barrel was ruined. Her family needed clean grain, and the only clean grain in the district was in a building that smelled like cat and sounded like war, owned by a woman the town had called Cat Widow. Ragna closed the bin. She replaced the inner board, the outer board, the stone weight. She did it slowly, with the care of someone handling the most valuable thing in the county, because at that moment it was. She had survived the crisis. The system held. The wheat was clean, but survival had created a new problem. Ragna was now the only farmer in the district with enough clean grain to matter, and the people who had laughed, the people who had threatened, the people who had sent boys to open her loft hatch and had sold her the worst claim in the township, those people were coming to her door, not with laughter, with wagons. And behind them, Lowell Katie was watching. A woman with clean grain and no protection was a different kind of target than a woman with cats and a granary full of gaps. Katie had wanted her to fail when failure meant buying her claim at a loss price. Now that she had not failed, he wanted something else. He wanted to be the one who controlled what happened next. The question was no longer whether Ragna could protect her grain from rats. The question was whether she could protect it from her neighbors. The wagons came the next day, 3 of them, before noon. The first belonged to a man named Decker, the same farmer who had opened his granary in December and found the floor alive. He had lost 40 bushels to contamination and another 20 to panic selling at Pell's reduced winter price. He had a wife, 2 sons, and enough flour to last until the second week of January. After that, he had nothing. Dekker did not ask politely. He stood at Ragna's door with his hat in his hands and his jaw working the way men's jaws work when they are about to say something that costs them pride. "I need 20 bushels," he said. "Clean wheat. I'll pay spring price in April." The second wagon carried a family Ragna knew only by sight, the Holts, who farmed 3 miles north. Their granary had not been overrun like Dekker's, but they had found droppings in 2 of their 6 sacks, and the smell of urine in the bottom layer of a third. They did not know which grain was safe. They wanted someone to tell them. The third wagon carried Agnes Rourke, who had already eaten the 5 pounds of flour Ragna gave her, and whose child was still feverish, and whose husband was in Fargo, and whose barrel was ruined, and who stood at the door not with a request, but with a silence that was louder than any word she could have chosen. Ragna did not sell everything. She did not sell at panic prices. She did not give it away. She measured. She opened the wheat bin with the same careful sequence: stone weight, outer board, inner board with lard seal, and used a tin scoop to fill sacks she weighed on a hand scale borrowed from Tollef's kit. Each family received what Ragna calculated they needed to survive until the roads opened. Flour, wheat for bread, and nothing more. No surplus, no hoarding margin, no seed grain. She wrote each amount on the back of a feed invoice in pencil. Dekker, 15 bushels. Holt, 12 bushels. Rourke, 8 bushels. She charged 45 cents a bushel, 3 cents above Pell's autumn offer, payable after spring harvest. She did not apologize for the price. The grain was clean. Clean grain in January was worth more than clean grain in October, and every person standing in her yard knew it. By the end of the first week of January, Ragna had distributed 63 bushels of wheat to 9 families. She kept 112 bushels for herself, enough for her own flour through spring, enough for seed, enough for the bank payment, and a margin of 15 bushels that she held against the possibility that the winter would last longer than anyone expected. The math was tight again. It had always been tight, but the numbers pointed forward instead of down, and that was something Ragna had not felt since the threshing belt took her husband. Hiram Pell came back on a Wednesday in the 3rd week of January. This time he came inside. He had never been inside the granary during operating hours, by which Ragna meant the hours after dawn, when she inspected the aisles, checked the sand trays, read the ash lines, and opened the bins for inventory. Pell had always visited from the outside, looking at the building the way a man looks at a thing he has already judged. This time he stepped through the south door and stood in the center of the main aisle and looked at the system the way a man looks at a thing he does not yet understand. Ragna walked him through it, not because he asked, because she wanted him to see. She showed him the sand trays. She explained the tracking. 5-toed prints with tail drag meant rat. Round, heavy prints meant cat. Smeared ash meant a body had been dragged. She showed him the exterior patches, the tin collars around the posts, the flattened lard tins over the gnawed corners, the double tin layer on the south wall hinge side, where the gap had nearly cost her the oat bin. She showed him the aisles, narrow lanes between the sealed bins and the outer walls framed with scrap boards, wide enough for a cat's body but too narrow for a rat to maneuver safely. She showed him the lath walkway overhead, where 4 cats lay draped across the strips like sentries between shifts. She showed him the sliding panels that controlled cat access, open at night for hunting, closed during the day for inspection. She showed him the bin lids, double-boarded, lard-sealed, stone-weighted. Pell looked at all of it. He ran his thumb along a tin collar. He crouched, slowly, because his knees were not young, and examined an ash line. He opened his ledger and for the first time in Rana's experience, he wrote something that was not a condemnation. "I told you 3 things work," he said. "Tin, poison, and paid men. I was wrong about the order." "The order? You did not start with killing rats. You started with protecting grain. That is a different problem." He closed the ledger. "I have been inspecting granaries for 30 years. I have always inspected from the rat's perspective. Where are they? How many? How do we kill them? You built from the grain's perspective. What is exposed? What is sealed? What is the path between the two? I have not seen that before." It was not an apology. Pell was not a man who apologized. It was an acknowledgement, delivered in the language of a professional who had encountered a method that contradicted his experience and had the honesty to say so. Ragna took it for what it was. "The cats are not the system," she said. "The cats are the last line. The system is the gaps." Pell nodded. "Your mother's lesson." "Her exact words." He tipped his hat, the same courtesy he had offered on his first visit, when it had been the only courtesy. This time it meant something different. Ragna watched him walk to his wagon and thought about what it had cost her to earn that nod. 7 weeks of labor, $5 in cats, a winter of bleeding hands and freezing water, and patching gaps in the dark while the prairie tried to take everything she had. The nod was worth it. Not because she needed Pell's approval, because Pell's approval meant the elevator would accept her grain without argument, and that meant the bank payment was secure, and that meant the claim was hers for another year. Agnes came 2 days later. She did not come to borrow flour this time. She came to learn. She stood in the granary with her arms crossed and her mouth set in the expression she wore when she was about to admit something that went against every opinion she had previously stated. Ragna knew the expression. She had seen it when Agnes returned the pickled beets in October. "Show me the ash lines," Agnes said. Ragna showed her. She showed her how to sprinkle the ash in a thin, even stripe, too thick and the prints blurred, too thin and the wind scattered it. She showed her how to read the tracks, direction, size, frequency. She showed her the difference between a rat exploring a new path and a rat running an established route. The exploring rat left wandering, hesitant prints. The running rat left straight, deep tracks with grease smears alongside. Agnes watched with the focus of a woman who had found droppings in her children's porridge and would never allow it again. "I need cats," Agnes said. "You need gaps patched first," Ragna said. "No cat goes to a barn with open seams. The cat becomes useless if the rat has 20 ways in and out. You close the paths first. You make the rat cross open ground. Then the cat becomes useful." Agnes looked at her. "You sound like a woman who has said that before." "I sound like my mother." Ragna sent 6 cats to Agnes's barn, but only after she and Agnes spent 2 days patching the gaps. They worked together in Agnes's drafty, ground-level grain shed, tacking tin over corners, packing clay into foundation gaps, and building a rough aisle frame from scrap lumber. Agnes's barn was smaller and worse than Ragna's granary, but the principle was the same. Seal the grain, expose the paths, let the cats work the lanes. Agnes's eldest daughter, the same girl who had brought cracked milk pans for the loft water in October, helped carry the cats in flour sacks. She was 12 and handled the sacks with a calm that impressed Ragna. The girl had been watching. She had been learning without being taught, the way children learn things that adults think they are hiding. Tolof's ribs healed slowly. He spent most of January on the spare blanket in Ragna's soddy, propped against the wall with a folded coat behind him, breathing in the shallow, careful way of a man whose chest punished every deep breath. He could not work, he could not climb, he could not carry, but he could talk. And in the long January evenings with the stove burning low and the wind pressing against the sod walls, he talked about Duluth. He talked about the grain warehouses along the harbor, massive timber structures, 4 stories high, where wheat from the western territories was stored in bulk bins waiting for the lake ships. He talked about the rats in those warehouses, not dozens, but thousands, populations so large that the night watchman could hear them moving through the walls like water through pipes. He talked about the ship cats that the captains brought from Europe and the warehouse cats that the foremen tolerated because traps and poison could not keep pace with the breeding. A warehouse rat breeds 5 times a year, Tolliff said. 8 pups a litter. 1 pair becomes 40 in 12 months. You do not kill your way out of that. You build your way out. Build how? Ragna asked, though she already knew. She wanted to hear him say it. You make the grain unreachable and the path to it dangerous. Same thing you did. Same thing anyone does who has thought about it for more than 5 minutes. The difference is the warehouses had money. They used zinc lining, concrete floors, steel doors. You use cats and tin cans and ash. The principle is the same. The material is different. Ragna sat with that. The principle is the same. The material is different. It was the clearest summary anyone had given her of what she had built, and it came from a man with 3 fingers and cracked ribs who had recognized the ash line on her threshold the way one craftsman recognizes another's hand. They argued once. It was about the oat bin. Ragna wanted to move the oats into the main wheat bin to consolidate the sealed space. Fewer bins meant fewer lids to inspect, fewer seams to monitor, fewer points of failure. Tolliff disagreed. He said mixed grain attracted different pests, wheat weevils in the wheat, grain moths in the oats, and that consolidation traded rat risk for insect risk. He wanted the oats kept separate, with their own double lid, their own ash line, their own inspection schedule. You are solving the wrong problem, Tolliff said. His voice was sharper than usual. The ribs made him irritable. You are trying to make less work. The work is the system. You take away the work. You take away the watching. You stop watching. You lose grain. I am one person, Ragna said. I cannot watch 6 bins and 40 aisles and 32 cats and haul water twice a day and grind flour and keep the stove lit and patch gaps every time the temperature changes. Something has to be simpler. Not the bins. The bins are where the grain lives. You make everything else simpler. You make the aisles simpler. You make the water easier. You build a trough instead of carrying pans, but you do not combine the grain. He was right. Ragna knew he was right, and the knowing made her angry, because being right did not make the work lighter. She kept the oats separate. She built a trough. Tolliff died on the 9th of February. The cracked ribs had not healed cleanly, whether the cold worsened the injury or whether the damage was deeper than either of them knew. The shallow breathing of January became the wet, labored breathing of early February. Ragna heard the change before Tolliff admitted it. The sound was wrong, thick, bubbling, the sound of lungs that were filling with something that did not belong. She brought him broth. She kept the stove hot. She piled blankets on him and stuffed rags into the gaps around the soddy door, and she did everything she could think of to do, which was not enough because she was not a doctor, and the doctor was in Fargo, and the roads were still closed, and the world outside the soddy was 20 below zero and white from horizon to horizon. On the 8th of February, Tolliff asked Ragna to bring him a piece of the lath strip from the granary, one of the walkway boards the cats used to patrol above the aisles. She brought a short piece cut from a broken end. He held it in his 3-fingered hand and tapped it against the blanket. Not the cat, he said. His voice was a whisper. The path. She nodded. You understand that, he said. You understood it before I came. I just helped you build it straighter. He died the next morning before dawn. Ragna was awake. She had been awake most of the night, listening to his breathing change, listening to the spaces between the breaths grow longer. When the last space did not end, she sat beside him in the dark soddy and held the lath strip he had been holding and did not cry, because there was water to haul to the loft and ash lines to check and a life that did not stop when the people in it did. She buried him on the rise behind the soddy. In frozen ground she had to break with a pickaxe. It took her most of a day. The cats watched from the granary loft hatch, a row of eyes in the dark rectangle, and the prairie wind carried the sound of the pickaxe across the flat white land in a rhythm that sounded like a slow heartbeat stopping. That evening she sat by the stove and looked at the lath strip he had tapped against the blanket. Not the cat. The path. She thought about the ash lines and the sand trays and the tin collars and the gap where the hinge had almost cost her the oat bin. She thought about the principle that was the same whether you had zinc and concrete or cats and tin cans. She thought about a man who came to laugh and stayed because he saw the ash. The granary was quiet. The cats hunted. The wheat waited. And Ragna Brekke was alone again, the way she had been alone in October, except that now she was alone with knowledge that another person had helped her build, and the building was still standing, and the grain was still clean. Spring came late. The snow held through March. The roads opened in the second week, then closed again after a late storm, then opened for good in early April. When the prairie finally thawed and the section roads turned to mud, the district faced a new problem that made the rat crisis look simple. Seed grain. Families that had eaten their clean wheat to survive the winter had no seed to plant. Families that had lost their wheat to contamination had no seed at all. Families that had sold to Pell at autumn prices had neither grain nor money to buy more. The spring planting season in the Red River Valley was short, mid-April to late May for hard red spring wheat. And every day without seed in the ground was a day of harvest lost in September. Lowell Cady saw the opportunity before anyone else. He had spent the winter quietly. After the public humiliation at Ragna's granary, Pell's admission, the wagons arriving at Ragna's door instead of his store, Cady had retreated into his business and waited. He had not stopped selling poison and traps. He had added a new inventory line. Grain sacks purchased from desperate families during the worst weeks of winter, at prices that reflected the buyer's leverage more than the grain's value. He had paid 25 cents a bushel for wheat that farmers needed to sell before it spoiled entirely. Some of those sacks were contaminated, some were not. Cady did not sort them. He stored them in his back shed behind the store and waited for the one moment when stored grain, any stored grain, would be worth more than its weight in silver. That moment was April. Cady announced seed wheat for sale at $1.15 a bushel, 3 times the autumn price, nearly 3 times what he had paid for it. And because Cady's grain had been stored in an unsealed shed with strychnine bait scattered on the floor, no one could be certain which sacks were clean and which were contaminated. Cady swore the grain was safe. He pointed to the poison as evidence. The bait had killed the rats, so the grain was protected. Ragna knew better. Poison killed rats. It did not clean grain. A dead rat in a sack was not the same as no rat in a sack. Strychnine left traces. Dead rats left decomposition. And grain stored on a dirt floor in an unsealed shed had been exposed to every field mouse, every contaminated puddle, every source of fouling that Cady's poison had not addressed. She went to Pell. His grain needs inspection, she said. Every sack, before anyone buys seed from that shed. Pell looked uncomfortable. Cady is a licensed storekeeper. His inventory is his own business. His inventory will go into the ground on 12 farms. If the seed is contaminated, those families lose the planting and the money. They lose 2 seasons, not one. You are asking me to inspect a man's private storage. I am asking you to do the job you told me you have been doing for 30 years. Pell rubbed his beard. He looked at his ledger. He looked at Ragna. She stood in his elevator office with flour dust on her sleeves and cracked skin on her knuckles, and the flat, immovable expression of a woman who had spent a winter protecting grain from everything that tried to destroy it and was not about to watch Lowell Cady sell rot to desperate families. I will inspect, Pell said. But not on your word alone. I need a complaint, a formal one. Agnes Rourke will file it, Ragna said, and Decker, and the Holts. Agnes filed the complaint the next day. She brought the dried droppings from her contaminated barrel in a jar, set it on Pell's desk, and said, That is what happens to families who trust a storekeeper instead of a grain bin. Inspect his shed, or I will open every sack myself on the main street. While the complaint worked its way through Pell's deliberate process, Ragna began what she had been thinking about since January, a seed exchange. She had 15 bushels of clean wheat beyond what she needed for her own planting and survival. 15 bushels was enough to seed roughly 8 acres. Not much, but not nothing. She offered the seed on terms. 1 bushel lent in April, 1¼ bushels returned after harvest in September. No cash, no markup for interest, just a 1/4 bushel premium for the risk that the borrower's crop might fail. It was not charity. It was a calculated bet that the families who planted clean seed would harvest clean grain, and that clean grain in the district made everyone safer, including Ragna, whose system depended on reducing the overall rat population, not just defending her own perimeter. She measured the seed on the same hand scale she had used in January. She inspected each sack before lending smell, color, kernel integrity, the absence of dust that indicated weevil activity. She rejected 2 sacks from her own inventory that showed faint discoloration near the seam, even though the grain inside was probably fine. Probably was not a word she allowed near seed that would determine whether families ate the following winter. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who needs to hear it. 3 families took seed from Ragna in the first week, then 5 more. Agnes became the second point of distribution, lending seed from her own small cat-protected supply to neighbors she trusted to repay. By the 3rd week of April, 8 farms in the district were planting with seed that had passed through Ragna's hands or Agnes's hands, inspected, weighed, and certified clean by the only standard that mattered. The grain had survived the winter in a sealed bin with ash lines on the sills and cats in the loft. Cady did not accept the inspection quietly. On the morning Pell arrived at the store with the formal complaint and a witness, Farber, the same deputy who had visited Ragna's granary in October. Cady met them at the door with his arms crossed and his face arranged in the expression of a man who has been wronged by people smaller than himself. You are inspecting my shed on the complaint of a woman who keeps feral cats and a farm wife who cannot keep her own barrel clean, Cady said. This is a licensed business. I have rights. You have the right to sell clean grain, Pell said. Open the shed. Cady opened the shed. The smell reached them before the light did. Pell stepped inside and stopped. Farber covered his nose. Ragna, who had come uninvited but whom no one ordered to leave, stood at the doorway and watched. The sacks were stacked on a dirt floor. Strychnine bait packets, waxed paper, some split open, some chewed through, littered the spaces between the stacks. Dead rats lay in the corners, not fresh kills, old bodies, dried and flattened, some partially decomposed. The poison had done its job. It had killed rats. but the rats had died inside the shed beside the grain, and their bodies had been left where they fell. The sacks nearest the floor showed dark stains where moisture had wicked up from the dirt. 2 sacks had visible gnaw holes patched with twine, Katie's store twine, the same braided cotton he sold by the yard. Pell opened a sack. He poured a handful of grain into his palm and held it to the light. The kernels were discolored. Some showed the gray-green tint of mold. The smell was sour, the same ammonia-tinged sourness that had marked every contaminated barrel in the district. "This is not seed grain," Pell said. "This is waste." "That grain is treated," Katie said. "The bait killed every rat in this shed." "The bait killed rats. It did not clean grain." Pell poured the kernels back. "I cannot certify this for sale, not as seed, not as flour wheat, not as feed." Katie's face changed. The wronged expression collapsed into something uglier, the face of a man whose calculation has failed and who is looking for someone to blame. He looked at Ragna. "You did this," he said. "You turned this town against proper methods so you could sell your cat barn wheat at whatever price you wanted. You created dependence. You made yourself the only source so you could control the market." Ragna looked at the dead rats on the floor. She looked at the stained sacks. She looked at the strychnine packets that had killed the rats and protected nothing. "I did not create the rats, Mr. Guadi. I did not create the winter. I kept my grain clean. You could have done the same." "With cats?" His voice cracked on the word. "With alley cats and tin cans and ash on the floor?" "With attention," Ragna said. "The cats were $5. The attention was free." Katie did not speak again. Pell marked the sacks with chalk, condemned, unfit for sale, and left the shed. Farber wrote in his notebook. The inspection was over. Gotti was not arrested. There was no law against storing grain badly. But the town knew. Within a week, every family that had considered buying seed from Katie's store learned what Pell had found in the shed. Katie's seed wheat sat unsold. His reputation, already damaged by the winter, settled into a permanent dent that no amount of strychnine could fix. He did not leave the district. Men like Katie never left. But he stopped talking about rats, and he stopped talking about Ragna Brekke, and in a small community where talk was the primary currency of influence, silence was its own kind of defeat. But Katie's silence came with one final act. The same week as the inspection, Ragna found a torn grain sack outside her granary door. It was placed against the south wall, near the threshold. A sack split along the seam, grain spilling onto the frozen ground, positioned to look as though it had been dragged from inside. Beside it, a dead rat. The implication was clear. Someone wanted it to appear that Ragna's granary had been breached, that her system had failed, that her grain was as compromised as anyone's, that the cat widow's clean wheat was a fraud. Agnes's daughter noticed the sack first. She had come to help carry water to the loft, a task she had taken on twice a week since Tollef's death, and she stopped at the corner of the granary and pointed. "That twine," the girl said. Ragna looked. The sack was tied with braided cotton twine. Katie's store twine, the same twine that patched the sacks in his shed, the same twine he sold by the yard from a spool behind his counter. Ragna picked up the sack. She examined the grain inside. It was discolored, sour-smelling, contaminated. Not her grain. Her grain was hard red spring wheat, golden brown, clean. This was old stock, the kind that had been sitting on a dirt floor for months. She carried the sack to the soddy and placed it on the table. She did not take it to Pell. She did not take it to Farber. She looked at it for a long time, thinking about what it meant that a man who had lost his seed business would spend a sack of his own condemned grain to frame a woman who had spent the winter keeping hers clean. She burned the sack in the stove. She swept the spilled grain from the threshold. She checked the sand trays, read the ash lines, and climbed the ladder to fill the water trough Tolef had taught her to build. The cats watched from the loft. The wheat waited in the bins, and the spring planting had begun. The spring of 1887 came slowly to the Red River Valley, as if the land itself was uncertain whether the winter had truly ended. Snow lingered in the coulees through the first week of April. Ice held along the creek banks until the middle of the month. The section roads dried and then froze again and then dried for good, and when the mud finally firmed enough to carry a loaded wagon, the district began to move. Ragna planted her 18 acres of wheat in the third week of April, using seed from her own sealed bins, the same grain she had protected through the worst winter in the region's short agricultural memory. She hired a neighbor's team for 2 days, the same arrangement as the previous year, and walked behind the cedar with the same cracked hands that had hammered tin and hauled water and buried a man on the rise behind the soddy. The seed went into the ground clean. Whether it came up clean was a question for September, but the planting itself felt different this year. Last spring she had planted because she had to. This spring she planted because the grain in the ground had a lineage she could trace from bin to seed to soil, and every step of that lineage was one she had controlled. 8 other farms planted with seed that had passed through Ragna's system. Some had borrowed directly from her. Some had borrowed from Agnes, who had protected a smaller stock using the same method. Nosam, patched gaps, narrow aisles, cats in the loft. Agnes had lost 2 sacks to a late-season breach in her grain shed's north wall, but the rest held. Her lending brought 3 families into the network, who might otherwise have bought from Sadie or gone without. By late April, the seed exchange had distributed every available bushel. Ragna's surplus was gone. Agnes's surplus was gone. The district's planting was thin, fewer acres sown than the year before, because fewer families had clean seed. But it was planted, and the seed was sound. Ragna turned her attention to the thing she had been building in her head since Tolef died, a system that could be taught. She started with the granary itself. On the back of the same feed invoice where she had recorded winter distributions, Ragna drew a diagram of her system, not an engineering blueprint. She did not have the vocabulary or the tools for that. A picture. A floor plan with labels written in her slow, deliberate English. The letters formed the way a woman forms letters who learned to write in a second language as an adult. The diagram showed 3 versions because Ragna had realized during the winter that the system needed to fit different buildings. The first version was the homestead granary plan, a small, raised structure like her own with sealed bins, narrow outer aisles, cat access through the loft, tin collars on the posts, and ash tracking lines on the sills. This was the simplest version. It required the least material and the fewest cats. 6 to 10 were enough for a building under 300 square feet. The second version was the barn loft plan, for farmers who stored grain in a section of a larger barn rather than a dedicated granary. The grain area was walled off from the livestock section with tight boarded partitions. Cat access came through holes cut low in the partition wall, leading into perimeter aisles. The cats lived in the hay loft above and descended to hunt. This version required more patching because barns had more gaps than granaries, but it worked on the same principle. Seal the grain, expose the paths, let the cats work the lanes. The third version was the elevator side holding room, a design Ragna had discussed with Tolef before his death, intended for the grain elevator in town where wheat was held between delivery and rail shipment. This was the most ambitious plan and the one Ragna was least certain about. Elevators were large, commercial, and managed by men like Pell who had their own methods. But elevators also lost grain to contamination during long storage periods, and Pell had already admitted that his inspection approach, looking for rats, was less effective than Ragna's approach, protecting grain. Ragna did not draw the elevator plan herself. She described it to Pell, who listened, asked questions, and drew his own version on the back of a ledger page. His version was cleaner than hers, straighter lines, better proportions, but the principles were identical. Seal the holding room, create perimeter lanes, use cats as the mobile pressure inside the lanes, track movement with ash or sand. Pell did not adopt the plan immediately. He was not a man who moved quickly on ideas that were not his own, but he pinned the drawing to the wall of his office, and when farmers came to the elevator with questions about storage, he pointed to it and said, "Ask Brekke." The teaching happened in pieces, spread across the spring and summer like seeds themselves. Ragna taught Agnes to check ash lines before dawn, the hour when the night's activity was freshest, and the tracks were undisturbed by wind or foot traffic. Agnes taught her eldest daughter, who taught the two Decker boys, who taught 3 children on a farm south of town. Within 2 months, a dozen children in the district could read a sand tray and distinguish rat tracks from mouse tracks, from cat tracks from sparrow prints. The children treated it as a game. Ragna let them. A game that taught vigilance was more durable than a lesson that demanded it. She taught Decker to patch from the outside. He had rebuilt his ground-level granary after the winter disaster, raising the floor on stone footings and closing the foundation gaps with packed clay and tin. He did not have cats. He did not trust them near his children's milk, but the exclusion work alone reduced his rat pressure by what he estimated was half. "Half is not enough," Ragna told him, "but half is better than nothing, and nothing is what you had before." She taught Holt's wife to build double-lidded bins. Mrs. Holt was a quiet woman who rarely spoke in public, but who could handle tools with a precision that surprised Ragna. She built her first double lid in an afternoon, fitting the inner board with a large seal so tight that Ragna could not slide a piece of paper between the lid and the bin wall. "Better than mine," Ragna said, and meant it. She taught the storekeeper's hired boy, not Katie's boy, but the boy at the other store, the smaller one run by a German named Wendt, who sold hardware and dry goods, to build tin collars for granary posts. The boy cut the collars from old stovepipe, the same material Ragna had used, and sold them for 10 cents apiece. Ragna did not ask for a share. The collars being available mattered more than the dimes. Each lesson followed the same structure, though Ragna never articulated it as a structure. First, she showed them the problem, the gap, the track, the contamination. Then she showed them the principle, seal the grain, expose the path. Then she showed them the technique, the patch, the collar, the ash line, the double lid. And only then, after the building was ready, did she talk about cats. "You make the rat cross open ground," she said every time to every person. "Then the cat becomes useful." It was her mother's lesson, filtered through Tollef's refinement, delivered in Ragna's own voice to people who had spent a winter learning what happened when they did not listen. They listened now. The cats became the visible symbol, even though Ragna insisted they were not the point. Children brought unwanted kittens, barn-born, feral-raised, the offspring of the district's unmanaged cat population, and asked Ragna to train them as grain cats. Ragna turned most of them away, not because the kittens were unwelcome, but because the farms that wanted them were not ready. "No cat goes to an unpatched barn," she said. She said it so often that Agnes started saying it too, and then Decker's wife, and then the children repeated it to each other as a kind of rule, the way children repeat rules they have learned from adults who mean them. The phrase entered the district's vocabulary the way practical knowledge enters any small community, not through books or announcements, but through repetition, correction, and the slow accumulation of experience. By midsummer, farmers who had never spoken to Ragna were patching their granary gaps before requesting cats. The order of operations, seal first, cat second, had become the standard approach, and the standard had been set by a woman who had been mocked for buying alley devils. Cat Widow Farm lost its sting. The name persisted. Names always persist in small communities, but the tone changed. Children said it the way children say the name of a place that is interesting rather than shameful. Farmers said it the way farmers say the name of a place where things work. Agnes said it the way Agnes said anything she had once mocked and now respected, with a slight tightening of the jaw that acknowledged the error without quite apologizing for it. By the following autumn, the harvest of 1887, 8 farms in the district had cat lofts, tin-collared posts, raised bins, and ash line inspections. Not all of them had 40 cats. Some had 6. One had 2. But all of them had sealed grain, and all of them had learned the difference that Ragna's mother had taught her in a cold storeroom in Norway. The difference between killing rats and protecting food. Josiah Venn arrived in the district in late August of 1887, driving a wagon loaded with hand tools and a portable lathe. He was 31 years old, born in Vermont, and he was a carpenter by trade and by temperament. A man whose hands moved toward problems the way water moves toward low ground. He had come west on the Northern Pacific Railroad to build houses for the expanding farm communities along the Red River, and he had stopped in the district because the district had work, and the rail line went no farther without crossing into territory he did not know. Ragna met him at Pell's elevator, where Venn had come to ask about local building contracts. Pell, who had become an unexpected advocate for Ragna's system, pointed Venn toward the Brekke claim. "She needs a carpenter," Pell said. "Or her granary needs one. The woman herself seems to need nothing." Venn drove to the claim on a Thursday afternoon. He found Ragna on her knees beside the granary's south wall, rehammering a tin patch that had loosened during a summer storm. She was using the same claw hammer she had used since October, and the handle was wrapped in cloth where the wood had split. Venn watched her for a moment. Then he stepped down from the wagon and said, "That hammer is going to break your wrist before it fixes that patch." Ragna looked up. She looked at the hammer. She looked at the man, whose hands were calloused in the pattern of someone who held tools for a living, and whose wagon carried more tools than she had seen in one place since leaving Norway. "It has not broken it yet," she said. "It will. The grain of the wood is split along the stress line. Another week, and the head comes off." He reached into the wagon and pulled out a hammer, new, balanced, with a hickory handle that had been shaped and sanded to fit a specific grip. "Try this one." Ragna took the hammer. She drove the nail she had been working on. The hammer seated the nail in 2 strokes instead of 5. The difference was immediate and obvious, the way the difference between a good tool and a bad tool is always immediate and obvious to someone who has been using the bad tool long enough to forget what good feels like. She handed the hammer back. "Keep it," Venn said. "I have 4 more." He did not ask to see the granary. Ragna showed him anyway, because the south wall patch was not holding, and she needed someone who understood wood better than she did to tell her why. Venn spent an hour inside the granary. He examined the aisles, the bin construction, the lath walkway, the tin collars, the double lids. He did not speak much. He touched things, running his hands along the joints, testing the boards for give, pressing his thumb against the tin patches to check whether they were tight or sprung. When he finished, he stood in the center of the building and looked at the ceiling. "You built this," he said. Most of it. Tolef Moen helped with the framing. He died in February. The lath work is his? Yes. It is good work. The joints are clean. Three-fingered? Ragna looked at him. How did you know? The nail spacing. A man with a full grip spaces nails by feel. A man with a short grip spaces them by measurement. These are measured. He pointed to the lath walkway. Every nail is exactly the same distance from the last. That is a man who cannot trust his hand, so he trusts his eye instead. Ragna felt something shift in her chest. Not grief. She had buried that with Tolef on the rise. Something else. Recognition. The same thing Tolef had recognized in the ash line. A craftsman seeing another craftsman's work and reading the person in the product. The south wall is your problem, Ven said. The warp is not in the board. It is in the foundation. The stone has settled unevenly. Every freeze-thaw cycle shifts it another fraction. You can patch the gap forever, or you can lift the wall, reset the stone, and pack it with gravel so it does not move again. I cannot lift the wall. I can. He paused. If you will show me how the ash lines work. I have not seen that before. They struck the arrangement without shaking hands or signing anything. Ven would repair the structural problems Ragna could not fix alone. The south wall foundation, the sagging door frame, 2 floor planks that had rotted from beneath. Ragna would teach him the integrated system, the exclusion, the tracking, the cat management, so he could build it into new granaries for other farms. The work took a week. During that week, Ragna learned that Josiah Ven was a man who talked very little and listened very carefully, who ate what was put in front of him without comment, who cleaned his tools before he cleaned himself, and who looked at her granary drawings with the same focused attention he gave to a joint he was cutting. He did not compliment the drawings. He corrected them. He showed her where her proportions were wrong, where her aisle widths did not match the numbers she had written, where a cat hole was drawn too high for a cat to use comfortably. He corrected them the way one professional corrects another, not with condescension, but with precision. Ragna found that she did not mind the corrections. She had minded Hiram Pell's corrections because Pell had been telling her she was wrong about everything. Ven was telling her she was right about the principles and inaccurate about the measurements, and there was a difference between those two things that mattered. The relationship grew through work. Ven took contracts to build granaries for 3 farms that autumn, and each one incorporated Ragna's system: raised floors, sealed bins, narrow aisles, cat access, ash tracking. He standardized the construction, consistent aisle widths, consistent cat hole dimensions, consistent post collar sizes, and charged a fair price that reflected the carpentry but not the design. The design, he told his clients, belonged to Ragna Brekke. He came to the claim most evenings. At first, the reason was professional. He had questions about the system, or he needed to check a measurement against Ragna's working model. Then the reasons became thinner. A tool he had left behind, a board he wanted to compare. Then the reasons stopped being reasons and became habit, which was the way things happened between 2 people who respected each other's competence before they acknowledged anything else. Ragna did not court him. Ven did not court her. They built things together, and the building was its own form of courtship, the trust of handing someone a tool and knowing they would use it correctly. The intimacy of working in a small space where hands brushed and neither person flinched. He proposed in November. Not with a ring or a speech. He proposed by bringing a set of plans for a new house. A proper frame house, not a sawdy ass, drawn on good paper with accurate measurements, and a notation in the corner that read Brekkeven, Section 14. The house had a kitchen large enough for a table that seated 6. It had a bedroom with a window facing east, and it had attached to the back by a covered walkway, a granary built to Ragna's specifications: raised floor, sealed bins, narrow aisles, cat loft, tin collars, double lids, ash lines. Ragna looked at the plans for a long time. She looked at the granary notation. She looked at the house. She looked at Josiah Venn, who stood in her soddy with his hat in his hands and sawdust in the creases of his knuckles, waiting. "The cat holes are too high," she said. "I know," he said. "I left them for you to correct." They married in December of 1887, in the same month that marked 1 year since the crisis night when Ragna had opened the wheat bin and shown Hiram Pell and Agnes Rourke that clean grain still existed in the district. The wedding was small. Agnes stood beside Ragna. Pell attended because Pell attended everything that involved grain farmers and record keeping. Farber came because someone told him there was cake. The years that followed compressed the way years always compress when the hardest work is finished, and what remains is the steady labor of maintaining what has been built. Ragna and Josiah expanded the claim slowly. They broke new acres each spring, 10 more in 1888, 8 more in 1889, until the full 160 acres were under cultivation. The new house went up in the spring of 1888, frame built with Josiah's hands and lumber hauled from the rail yard. The granary attached to it was the finest in the district, raised on stone footing set in gravel, sealed with proper joinery instead of patches, fitted with tin collars that Josiah forged himself from sheet iron. The cat loft held 12 cats, not 40, because the building was tight enough that 12 was sufficient. Agnes's system expanded alongside Ragna's. By 1889, Agnes managed a small network of 4 farms that shared cats, traded seed, and inspected each other's granaries before harvest. She had become, without intending it, the district's second authority on grain storage, the practical complement to Ragna's technical knowledge. She never fully abandoned her skepticism. When new families moved into the district and asked about the cat system, Agnes told them the truth. It works, but it works because of the gaps, not because of the cats. If you remember nothing else, remember that. Hiram Pell added a clean holding room at the grain elevator in the autumn of 1888. He asked Ragna to inspect it before the first wheat arrived. She walked through it the way Pell had walked through her granary the previous January, slowly, touching the walls, checking the joints, reading the construction the way she read the ash lines. She found 2 gaps. Pell fixed them before she finished her inspection. He did not need to be told what a gap meant. He had learned. The district's language changed. Brekke's clean barn replaced Cat Widow Farm in common usage, though the children still said the old name with a kind of affectionate pride, the way children claimed things that once embarrassed adults. The barn cats, descendants of the original 40, plus recruits from the district's feral population, became a recognized category of working animal, distinct from house cats or barn mousers. A Brekke cat, people said, was a cat that lived in a loft, hunted in an aisle, and never touched the grain. The distinction was not about the cat. It was about the building the cat lived in. Ragna kept the original granary standing. Josiah offered to tear it down 3 times. The wood was warped. The foundation was cracked. The tin patches had rusted through in places. But Ragna refused. She repaired it each spring. She kept the ash lines on the sills. She kept the sand trays inside the doors. She kept one cat in the loft, the orange Tom with half an ear, who had swiped her arm on the 3rd day and who had outlived every other cat from the original 40. He was old now, slow, and he spent most of his days sleeping on the lifted stair that Tolliff had designed and Josiah had rebuilt. He did not hunt anymore, but he was there, and being there was enough. Children came. A daughter in 1889, a son in 1891. Ragna taught them to read ash lines before she taught them to read English. The daughter took to it immediately, tracing the prints with her finger the way Ragna's mother had guided Ragna's hand along the iron hinge of a grain chest in Hallingdal. The son preferred building things with Josiah. Both of them grew up knowing that the difference between a full winter and a hungry one was not how much grain you grew. It was how much you kept clean after you grew it. By the winter of 1891, more than a dozen farms in the district used some version of Ragna's system. Not all had cats. Some had 6. Some had 2. One farm, the Holt place, managed by the quiet woman who built double lids better than Ragna, had no cats at all but had sealed its granary so tightly that the ash line showed no rat tracks for 3 consecutive months. The cats were the visible part, the invisible part, the patching, the sealing, the tracking, the double lids, the raised floors, the principle that a rat could be stopped by architecture before it was stopped by a predator. That was the part that lasted. Ragna lived out her life on the same claim. The 160 acres that had been a debt and a sentence became a working farm and a quiet proof that competence, applied with patience and maintained without compromise, could hold against everything the prairie sent. The granary, the new one, Josiah's build, stood for decades. The old one, the patched and warped original where 40 feral cats had fought rats through the worst winter in the territory's memory, stood as long as Ragna repaired it, and not a season longer. When it finally came down, the tin patches fell in a pile that clinked like dull coins. Underneath them, the ash stains remained on the wood like fingerprints of every night Ragna had read the sills by lantern light. In the end, people remembered the cats. They remembered the noise, the yowling, the half-eared orange tom sleeping on the step. The old farmers remembered something else. They remembered the clean wheat. They remembered the weight of a sack that smelled like grain and nothing else. In a winter when every other sack in the county smelled like rot. They remembered a woman on her knees in frozen mud, hammering tin over a gap that would open again tomorrow, because tomorrow was a problem for tomorrow, and today the wheat was still clean. $5 for alley devils. That is what Lowell Cady had called them, standing in Ragna's yard with the deputy and the elevator man, his face arranged in the certainty of a man who knew that proper methods cost proper money and that anything bought for 12.5 cents apiece was worth exactly that. $5 for 40 hissing, flea-bitten, feral animals that no one in the district wanted, pulled from alleys and rail yards and children's flour sacks, hauled to a leaning granary on a widow's claim, and set loose in a loft above 200 bushels of hard red spring wheat, while the neighbors shook their heads, and the storekeeper threatened a lien, and the elevator man wrote condemnations in his ledger. $5 for noise, $5 for claws, $5 for every creature the town had thrown away. But the cats were never the whole answer. The answer was the woman who understood what the others had missed. The rat did not have to eat a winter's food to destroy it. It only had to touch it first. A winter morning, fresh snow outside the granary, no tracks across the ash line, one cat asleep on the lifted stair. Behind the sealed boards, the wheat waits clean. Saki om,